Good afternoon, everybody. Just give everybody a few minutes to join in here. I think we're ready to go. Great. Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's session here about CMMC cost-saving strategies. My name is Anwar Kibriya. I'm part of an organization called Ace of Cloud. We are a registered provider organization accredited through CMMC to help organizations get through their CMMC efforts. Just wanted to start with a quick background on myself and my partner who's also on the call. We are both the former program managers at Microsoft and Blackboard. We've helped multiple large organizations get through their FedRAMP, ISO, SOC 2, and CMMC efforts. Again, we've been, our backgrounds coming from the federal contracting space and then now translating into the commercial spaces and the commercial vendors who are trying to go after these government certs. So, continuing to start, what is the intro to CMMC? Again, understanding that most of the folks on this call, you all are very well aware of CMMC, have a lot of familiarity with it. So just going to quickly go over this in one slide. What is it? The CMMC is the Department of Defense's guidance and regulations for DIB contractors and subcontractors processing CU, which is across your supply chain of everybody supporting your contract there. CMMC is built off of the NIST 800-171 and 172 control frameworks, and we can dive more into those in the levels. As well as it also follows the 837 risk management framework. So you'll see a little bit of that in the further slides as we continue. As mentioned, with part of the new CMMC V2, there are 3 levels from the previous 5, level 1 being foundational, level 2 being advanced with 110 practices aligning to NIST 171, and level 3 being aligned to 172. Most recently, CMMC, as we mentioned, has launched its V2, and then the contracts, you should expect to see them, CMMC requirements and adherence sometime in July 2023 is what the expected date is today. Quickly to go over the 3 levels here. Again, level 1 being foundational. This is more for low impact level data. So think public site where information is posted, right? Or some publicly available type of information. Level 2 moving into more moderate impact. Now, level 2 does have 2 separate assessment paths, as you can see here. Moderate impact level programs that are not as sensitive, so think like a training module or training product, stuff that just doesn't have any type of sensitive, super sensitive data, but enough of an impact to align it with level 2 CMMC. And then there's moderate impact level for sensitive programs. Now, these are items such as programs that might have trade secret info or sensitive training information. You might have some PII data in there. So all of those types of moderate impact level sensitive programs, they follow a different path, and it's the more traditional one in terms of if you're familiar with FISMA and FedRAMP to do it on a 3-year basis, and to have a third party complete this assessment. And then finally, there's level 3, which are the 110 practices based on 801-172, which is for high impact level programs. Now, high impact level programs are stuff that you might see like vulnerability management data or SCIF data, but really it's very important that you work with your customer to identify what types of data and that classification strategy together. And again, this is going to have a drastic impact on what your cost is for CMMC. So quickly to break down the cost here of what it looks like at CMMC, right? The first thing you have to understand that CMMC is a organization-wide type of cert versus just being restricted to the information system. So everybody from the top-down leadership has to have a commitment there for CMMC, right? The cost of compliance, it's solely going to matter on the maturity of the organization. Now, it's a double-edged sword here, so it's important to keep this in mind that, for example, if you're already aligned to existing certifications, it may help with certain processes that you might have in place. So you might have a robust account management process, a robust account audit logging process, or a vulnerability management program currently in place. Excuse me. So although that certainly helps, the thing about CMMC, it's also important to remember that CMMC will have certain prescriptive controls that might go above and beyond or might not align totally with the existing certification you're at. So it's always important to keep in mind understanding what type of data you're processing and what impacts and regulations and standards are going to affect that type of data so you can make your approach aligned to that. Okay. So there's three main areas that we suggest that, and in our experience, that we have seen that people really have to focus on in order to get through CMMC, where most of their cost is going to go to. So these are technology, process and resources, and finally compliance, right? And I'll double click on each of these in the following slides. But at a high level, right, from a technology standpoint, understanding that technology and process and resources, as you'll see throughout the slides, they sometimes can have some overlap. Obviously, if you have people acquire great technology to put less of a stress on their resources. However, in the same token, if you get more technology, you might need people with specialized skill sets as well. So those resources are going to be important to keep in mind as well. Excuse me. So this is just a high level vendor scenario example here, right? Again, this understanding your budget may be higher or lower, right? This I'm taking just a scenario that we've seen with some of our other clients where their budget is about 350K total and how they would break it out across the three key areas that we spoke about. So if you're looking at, say, technology, you're going to have AWS costs if you're using a cloud, or if you have a data center, you're going to have data center costs, any tools and or services that you kind of bring into scope as well. Excuse me. Those will also kind of come into effect and should be considered for the cost. Now, for process and resources, right? This is going to be stuff that we mentioned. You might need to bring on people with specialized skill sets or certain locations or certain citizenship requirements here, particularly for CMMC. So if you're looking at this, so process and resources, one of the things that you might need to have is if you have a Splunk tool that you set up, if you don't have the resources to monitor that Splunk log on a regular basis, you might need to hire a SOC to ensure that this is continuously happening on a regular basis. And finally, for compliance, you're looking at costs in terms of the RPO advisory, and then which is where we kind of fit in, is to help guide you understanding how to accomplish your CMMC requirements in a cost-effective manner and in a manner that actually gets you compliant, of course. And then finally, the C3PAO, which also comes in to validate your security posture that you have committed to. Now, the fun part about how we're going to save money, right? So first things first, when it comes to technology, the most important thing, one of the first steps you're going to take when going after CMMC is determining the accreditation boundary. This is extremely important because this is saying to the auditor and to your authorizing official, this is what is in scope for CMMC. These are all the technology components and these are all the resources that will all support CMMC and the handling and processing and storage of CUI data. Okay. Excuse me. And I'll dive more into enclaves as well in our further slides, but the other things you also want to consider are any external tools and or service providers that you'll be using, right? The one key thing is for CMMC, it's checking through your entire supply chain. So if you are using an external tool, say you're using a vulnerability management tool that's a SaaS provider, Are they CUI compliant? Do they have the same CMMC level compliance that you are subject to, and can they meet that, right? And do they have their certification things aligned? So that way it provides the government the assurance that yes, although they might send it to external entities, these are all accounted for and they all have the same security posture that that we are subjecting our vendor to, right? Another important thing to keep in mind, corporate and shared services may be limited in use, right? Now, there's a thing called CMMC enclaves, right? So I'm going to take a step back and talk about the accreditation boundary again, right? So if you are drawing your boundary and saying that my entire organization is going to support CMMC and these clients, then it would make sense for you to say our entire organization is going to be CMMC level 2, right? Where we've seen companies decide to have enclaves is if they have either multiple customers or multiple frameworks that they need to support, and not all of the regulations will align, right, to support them. So, to give an example, you might have some resources and engineers that are not in the US that are monitoring your commercial environment. This is going to obviously not allowed within CMMC. So those are the things where you might have to draw out enclaves, right? But in order to understand how to cut the costs and to minimize your costs, you have to understand and make that decision as an organization. Are we doing it as an org-wide cert, or are we limiting this certification to particular enclaves that our organization will support, right? So similar to how we talked about SIM tools, or excuse me, external tools and service providers that might be for external vendors, this is also counts for corporate Active Directory, right? If you're using that corporate Active Directory to log into the CMMC environment, these are things that are going to be called into scope as well. Another thing that we've seen is stuff like printers, right? In CUI assessments, if you're printing regular information at the same place where you're printing CUI data, the handling of that CUI data must be specific to that printer, right? So what we've seen in other organizations is they'll have a printer exclusively dedicated to CUI, or they might have to badge access in order to print something. And this is just to ensure that CUI is marked and handled appropriately. Another thing that also has to do with technology is the environment must be in the continental US, right? So this is for data centers and for cloud service providers. So obviously understanding most data centers that if you're supporting the DoD, they're already, I'm sure a lot of them in the US, but cloud service providers is something extra to pay attention to as well, because you have to ensure that whatever cloud you're setting up on is located in the US. So to give an example, use AWS East, you can use, I think, AWS East West or GovCloud, but you have to be wary of going to, say, AWS Europe or something. All right. So these are the very important things to keep in mind in terms of technology. And again, I can't stress this enough, extremely important for you to focus on the accreditation boundary. Processes and resources, right? So these are, again, some of the particulars here, right? It's only US-based personnel that are allowed to access CUI data. And depending on the agency, in most contracts is specified, it's US citizens that have to only have access to that. Now, from a cost standpoint, right? Again, you have to decide the processes that you have today, are they meeting what you need for CUI? So again, if you're using a support team or SOC team that's outside of the US, you will have to consider that in terms of your budgeting for CMMC. So if you're starting from scratch, or if you are only a US-based company, that obviously helps that conversation a lot more. So again, back to what we talked about earlier, your maturity model is going where you're at today is going to highly drive how much investment that you might need to make into CMMC. One of the more important controls that CMMC really covers that sometimes you might, especially if you're using like cloud systems that you might just pass over, right? Or if you're using like a managed CSP for data centers, stuff like physical environmental controls or media protection controls. Typically, they're handled by somewhere else, but if you're processing CUI data within your office location, right? So this isn't just structured data and I'm sending logs or database tables or anything. This is actual physical paper, right? Excuse me. All of those must also come into scope for CMMC. So if you're processing, again, like we mentioned, printing out documents and everything of that nature, CMMC will also bring your office into scope as well. Likewise, for physical and environmental, if you're processing CUI data at those locations, those physical and environmental controls come into place too. So do you have cameras and alarms, etc.? So you can go through the PE controls to get a full understanding of those. Again, to kind of piggyback off the media side, there's also things called information protection or data loss prevention tools and or processes, right? As we mentioned, CUI data is protected at both structured and unstructured data sets. There are tools currently in place. And let me quickly break down structured and unstructured data, right? So if we say structured is like database tables, a field within ServiceNow, etc. Unstructured data sets, now you're looking at emails, right? You quickly send an email to somebody and you have some CUI data in there, right? Talking about a CUI information, you might send an information about a ticket that has CUI on it. So those types of things are considered unstructured data. Now, CMMC does require you to, again, protect these data accordingly, right? So there are tools in the marketplace that are available today. And you'll see things like Microsoft Information Protection or Titus or whatnot. So those tools are there. However, we suggest that you work with usually like an RPO like ourselves to be able to identify exactly what you need, right? What we've seen with some of these tools and whatnot, like anybody that knows a lot of these big product companies, they make a lot of money on every time they encourage you to upgrade on your licensing, right? So, Microsoft, they'll always tell you, let's go to E5 to do everything right way, right? So we have determined other methods that, you can maybe have an E3 license and I had some modifications on that. So working with an RPO will certainly help you kind of identify those types of areas where you can save and maybe not have to necessarily make that type of investment. And again, lastly, process deviations, right? This is important that if you're already a mature organization and you have your methods set in the way you're setting your security posture, you might have to make some deviations. Again, like we mentioned, where you're sending your log data to, right? Who is accessing that log data, etc. Okay. And finally, it's compliance costs, right? So we've talked about the RPOs and how important it is for us, for organizations to really keep these type of organizations in mind when developing their security packages. And the reason for that is obviously the first part is, helping you be compliant. These are experts that understand the CMMC rules and regulations fairly well and can help you architect your environment in a way that is not only compliant, but cost effective as well, right? The other benefit that you'll see with having an RPO is long term, it can help with your cost as well, because now once you go to an assessment, the C3PAO has a duty to validate the security posture, right? To the best of its ability. If your package C3PAOs have a certain way of looking at documents and at systems and how to assess them, and there is a certain format and presentation that they're looking for in terms of how controls are written, what evidence is provided, and how things are done. So having an RPO gives you the benefit of being able to put that package and to have a smooth sailing with your assessment company. So then they get to consume the information fairly quickly and then hopefully give you the blessings to be authorized and move on to your continuous monitoring phase. And again, to moving on to continuous monitoring is exactly what it sounds like, right? It's to ensure that you are maintaining that same security compliance posture you have throughout your entire life cycle. Okay, they want to make sure that you're committing that we do vulnerability scans on a monthly basis. You might have to send these copies of these artifacts and these scans to your AO to say, yes, see, we are doing monthly scans, or we're doing annual assessments of our security controls to validate that we're still functioning as needed. Okay. Excuse me. Sorry, allergies are killing me out here. All right. So moving into our approach, right? Where we kind of take the approach from Ace of Cloud, and I think where most RPOs will kind of take a similar approach. Whereas the first thing is you have a kickoff meeting, you have to identify who your stakeholders are, right? Who are the representatives here that are going to have an impact on what you're going to write in the security controls or how they will implement these security controls. Second step, identifying the scope and the accreditation boundary and the data types. Again, as I mentioned, this is extremely critical, right? Once you have to know the data types that you're processing so you understand the impact levels that you're subject to. Once you understand the impact levels you're subject to, understanding what scope, what components are actually processing that data. Where is CUI going, right? Are you using external service providers? Where is the scope of the assessment that the auditor will come validate, right? Because again, what the important thing to understand about C3POs as well, that assessors have a duty and an obligation to either recommend you for moving forward with an ATO or denying the ATO, right? So if they call out a lot of risk and saying some major findings that maybe your scope and your accreditation boundary isn't set right, it could lead you to having your assessment redone, have the package resubmitted, which obviously, as you all are aware, results in higher cost. Okay. So from our step, we always like to get all of these things out the way first, have an agreed upon scope, make sure that this all makes sense and that we're doing everything the way we should be before moving on to the assessment route. Collecting, reviewing an existing documentation. Again, so if you have a current mature model and an information system, how you're running it, our job, we want to make sure that we don't want to recreate the wheel if we need to, right? So we want to look at where you're at. What are the gaps here that maybe you might not have in terms of documentation side of things, right? What can we understand about the system before off the bat? And obviously using that information to finally perform a gap assessment, right? Now, this is where we're kind of drilling down, excuse me, on each of the security controls to identify whether you actually are fully implemented, you're partially implemented, or you're not meeting the control at all. And then what are the steps and remediation steps you can take to get to a compliance state, right? We want to find out where the bodies are buried, right, before the auditor finds them. So that's the approach that we as an RPO take to protect our clients during the course of this engagement. Again, as we mentioned, providing remediation suggestions as well. So this is stuff where not some RPOs do this if they have it on staff. We as Ace of Cloud, we do this quite a bit where we'll not only walk you through remediation suggestions on how to fix the control, but we also will help you figure out how to cut your cost in terms of what technology you implemented, right? Maybe you don't need all of these extra tools and services to be compliant with CMMC. You might need a small subset of those things. So that's one of our expertise, is being able to identify not only control gaps and where you can really, help with that, but also from a architecture standpoint of saying how you can kind of remediate those as well and save the most money. And finally, based on all of these remediation or the gap assessment and all that, all of our interviews, existing documentation that we'll collect, And obviously, we'll have to develop some as well. And we'll put together a CMMC A&A package. Now, an A&A package consists of a system security plan, is basically your Bible for everything that you do in the security for CMMC and how you meet your security controls. There's also plans, policies, and procedures, right, that will also supplement that. So this is stuff like a disaster recovery plan. You have a configuration management plan, POAM management plan. These are the types of things that you want to kind of keep in your arsenal as well of documents that you can provide to your assessor. And finally, we'll put together a plan of action and milestone document, or in short, it's called POAMs. And POAM is really all of the gaps that you have in putting together a strategy on how you're going to fix it. And really, it's a tracking sheet, if you will, on what issues you have, what are the weaknesses that are affecting the system, and how we can remediate them, who the responsible parties are, etc. So again, at a high level, that's what we provide. We also, for Kanban activities, again, if you have resources on staff to help with that type of stuff, that's excellent. But we also offer like ISO as a service. So if you'd like to keep your retainer on us for set hours a month, that we can also help you perform security activities to ensure that your compliance posture is met. Okay. Um, so yeah, that brings me to the end of my deck. Any questions that we have here? And Siam, I'll let you kind of dictate how this is gonna go. Sorry.